Who really was Napoleon Bonaparte? How did a mere artillery lieutenant manage to conquer an entire continent? Welcome to Sagicon, where history comes alive and each video immerses you in the fate of those who have shaped the world. Today, get ready to travel back in time and walk in the footsteps of Napoleon Bonaparte. From his meteoric rise to legendary battlefields, from the gilded salons of Versailles to the icy steppes of Russia, we will follow the incredible destiny of a man who upended the world order, an epic adventure where glory, power, genius, and tragedy intertwine in a story that surpasses fiction. But before embarking on a new adventure, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything. Thank you, and have a good journey. At the twilight of the 18th century, France is in turmoil. The monarchical regime, symbolized by Louis XVI, struggles to cope with a chronic financial crisis. The state coffers, burdened by successive wars, notably the costly American War of Independence, and an archaic tax system, struggle to fill. In the Parisian salons, Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Diderot challenge the very foundations of royal authority and noble privilege. While new ideas circulate, the people themselves bear the brunt of taxes and suffer from high bread prices. This absolute monarchy, which seems so solid under Louis XIV, now teeters on its foundations. On the international stage, late 18th century Europe is a true field of rivalries. The great powers, Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Great Britain, seek to expand their spheres of influence or safeguard their interests. France, though influential, must contend with the territorial ambitions of its neighbors and the emergence of new power dynamics. In this context, where the European balance is constantly renegotiated, exceptional figures can suddenly rise and make history. It is precisely in this climate of social tensions, intellectual innovation, and geopolitical upheaval that Napoleon Bonaparte emerges, born in Corsica in 1769. He will grow up as France gradually enters an unpredictable revolutionary period, and his individual destiny will quickly become intertwined with that of the entire nation. But before becoming the man who would shape Europe at the turn of the century, he was first a Corsican child from a large family, whose rise was by no means guaranteed. Corsica is a Mediterranean island located between France and Italy. On this very island, on August 15, 1769, in the city of Ajaccio, Letizia Ramolino gave birth to Napoleone di Buonaparte, who would later become Napoleon Bonaparte. He was born shortly after the island's conquest by the Kingdom of France. Indeed, the Republic of Genoa had ceded Corsica to France in 1768, and the pacification of the island was still far from complete. Many Corsicans, under the leadership of Pasquale Paoli, had fought to defend their independence. Pasquale Paoli is a major political and military leader of Corsica, a key figure in the island's independence struggle. Inspired by Enlightenment philosophers' ideas, he led Corsica from 1755 to 1769 by establishing a democratic constitution before being defeated by the French at Ponte Novo. He went into exile in England after the French conquest. This fierce resistance fostered a strong sense of identity among the islanders, and young Napoleone would grow up with this Corsican pride. The Bonaparte family claimed a minor local nobility. His father, Carlo Maria Buonaparte, was a lawyer and representative of Corsica at the court of the King of France. He enjoyed a certain social status, but remained far from the great French aristocracy. His mother, Letizia Ramolino, from a respectable Corsican family, was renowned for her determined character and sense of economy. Napoleon was thus born into a milieu that was neither destitute nor truly wealthy. The family relied on modest incomes, primarily linked to the administrative and legal functions of the father. Although not living in poverty, the Bonaparte family experiences the challenges typical of an island recently integrated into France. Opportunities remain limited, roads are in poor condition, and political tensions between Pauli's supporters and those who chose to rally to the French government can weigh on daily life. Yet Carlo, ambitious, constantly seeks to assert his noble rights. He sends requests and produces documents to justify the Florentine ancestry of the Buonaparte family, claiming that they descend from lines once established in Tuscany. This legend, which he spreads to enhance his prestige, will become one of the memorable anecdotes around Napoleon. It will be said that he liked to recall his supposedly illustrious lineage to bolster his authority. In this turbulent context, the very date of Napoleon's birth often fuels historical debate. Some point out that he was born just a few months after the formal surrender of Corsica to France, making him a French subject from the moment of his birth. Others note that despite this legal status, the Corsican identity remained extremely vibrant in the family. Later, Napoleon himself would not hesitate to play on this duality. Sometimes, he would present himself as a proud and uncompromising Corsican, at other times as a determined French patriot ready to serve the nation. This ambiguity would characterize his career and his relationship with the island. In the early years of his life, Napoleone grew up in the heart of Ajaccio, in a family home that still exists today and has become a museum. He is the second surviving child after his brother Joseph, born a year earlier. The Bonaparte siblings would grow further. Lucien, Elisa, Louis, Pauline, Caroline, and Jerome would complete this large family. The relationship Napoleon had with Joseph and Lucien would be particularly important for his future political career, with the three brothers forging from childhood a complex bond of solidarity, rivalry, and strong individual ambitions. From a young age, Napoleone reveals a determined temperament. In Ajaccio, he is described as a solitary child, preferring the company of books to outdoor games, although he does not disdain imaginary battles with his peers. According to some accounts, he loves reading about great conquerors and seems fascinated by stories of ancient wars. This early interest in military strategies and warrior glory is reflected in his first attempts to lead his peers, whom he lines up as if they were soldiers. He develops a sense of authority that sometimes surprises or even irritates those who feel belittled by this young, ambitious boy. Napoleon's mother, Letizia, is known for her strictness and piety. It is said that she demonstrated great discipline with her children, getting them accustomed early to deprivation and effort. This Spartan upbringing would have a lasting impact on young Napoleone. He would maintain a taste for frugality throughout his life and an ability to endure difficult living conditions. In his future campaigns, he wouldn't hesitate to march with his soldiers, cross inhospitable lands, and be content with meager meals. His father, Carlo, sees education as a means to advance his family on the French social ladder. When the opportunity arises in 1779, he enrolls Napoleone in a program that allows sons of the minor nobility to receive military training on the mainland. He bets on the royal scholarship granted to a few Corsicans to finance this education. For Napoleone, leaving the island so young constitutes a major upheaval. He leaves behind the warmth of family, the landscapes of Corsica, and a linguistic environment where Italian and Corsican are spoken daily. He will now have to adapt to a rigid, mainly French-speaking system, sometimes unwelcoming to islanders. In 1779, Napoleon Bonaparte entered the Royal Military School of Brienne-le-Château in the Champagne region, thanks to a royal scholarship obtained through his father's efforts. He was only 9 years old at the time, which was very young to be admitted to such a strict institution, but this type of early military training was common for sons of noble or semi-noble families. At Brienne, he discovered a whole new world, a castle converted into a school, austere buildings, a program focused on scientific subjects, mathematics, geometry, artillery, discipline, and above all, preparation for a career in the military. From the start, adjusting was difficult. Napoleon didn't speak French perfectly and faced taunts from some classmates who called him the little Corsican. He experienced a deep sense of isolation, exacerbated by his lack of financial resources. The scholarship covered tuition, but his family couldn't provide the same comfort as the others from aristocratic backgrounds. Uniforms, food, books, everything was provided on a minimal basis. Yet his natural pride kept him from complaining, and he found refuge in academic work. The records of the School of Brienne indicate that Napoleon excelled particularly in mathematics, an essential discipline for those aspiring to become artillery officers. His logical and methodical mind thrived there. Similarly, he developed a passion for history, where he discovered the tales of past civilizations, great battles, and military achievements. He was already building a solid strategic education, admiring the feats of Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, or Frederick II of Prussia. Several teachers noted that he devoured books on tactics and geography, and that he was capable of drawing maps with astonishing precision. But even though his intelligence was recognized, his reserved manners and Corsican accent continued to set him apart from the group. He didn't seek to make friends with everyone, preferring the company of a few companions who shared his seriousness. It is said that he spent his leisure hours reading or meditating alone in a corner of the courtyard, dreaming of military glory. At the time, other students nicknamed him the straw in the nose, derived from La Paolina, in reference to his Corsican family, or considered him too serious, too reserved. This solitude forged through adversity. He would carry like armor throughout his life. A famous anecdote illustrates his character. Some winters, in the Brienne courtyard, the students built snow forts and simulated sieges. Napoleon, passionate, led one of the teams with particular zeal. He conceived strategies, ordered skirmishes, calculated the angles of snowball shots. This simple children's game turned, in his hands, into a true tactical exercise. He was determined to win, even if it was just a diversion. On several occasions, his troop of classmates won the victory thanks to his determination and ability to give clear orders. During these years, he also began to write his early reflections on politics and war. Small writings found later reveal an already mature mind, keen on understanding the nature of power and the role of the army in the state. Certainly, these texts were still awkward and lacked depth, but they showed a burning desire to rise above his condition as an isolated student. Over time, he created an internal image of himself, a future officer capable of reforming the army, distinguishing himself in combat, and perhaps one day exerting considerable influence over the nation's destiny. From 1782, Carlo Bonaparte, Napoleon's father, fell ill. He went to Montpellier to try to treat stomach cancer, but died in 1785. This early loss affected Napoleon, who found himself at 15 with the moral responsibility of being the man of the family, even though he was not the eldest. He wrote to his mother regularly, sharing his concerns about the family's financial future. This acute awareness of precarity further fueled his ambition. In 1784, Napoleone, now Gallicized as Napoleon Bonaparte in the records, completed his schooling at Brienne with outstanding results in mathematics and artillery. It was thanks to these good grades that he gained admission to the prestigious École Militaire in Paris, an even more elite institution reserved for the best students. He was only 15, making him one of the youngest admitted. His school record highlights his analytical mind, sense of organization, and concentration skills, all assets he would soon bring to the service of the French army. A final anecdote, often recounted, sums up these years at Brienne. It is said that in a report, a teacher noted that the young Bonaparte was authoritarian and enjoyed solitude. However, he added that this exceptional student possessed a strong character and a passionate desire to learn. This brief portrait, painted by a master who had closely observed him, already shows the seed of the man who, 20 years later, would make Europe tremble. His reputation as the Little Corporal, a term tinged with irony at the time, would turn against his critics as he rapidly climbed the military hierarchy. When Napoleon left the École Militaire in Paris in October 1785, he was not yet 16. His academic results in mathematics, fortification, and artillery convinced his superiors of his potential. He obtained the rank of second lieutenant in an artillery regiment, thus joining the garrison of Valence in the Rhone Valley. Military records indicate that he received a modest salary of about 100 to 200 livres per year, barely covering his daily expenses. In Valence, garrison life was paced by exercises, equipment maintenance, and soldier training. The French army, then under the authority of Louis XVI, was still marked by strong social hierarchies. The nobility of the sword dominated the most prestigious positions, and officers from the lesser nobility, like Bonaparte, struggled to find a place in it. Nonetheless, Napoleon keenly observed the workings of his regiment. He analyzed firing methods, the importance of precision in handling cannons, and the necessity of artillery mobility on the battlefield. He already noted how intelligence and topography could offer a decisive advantage during engagements. By his own admission, these reflections formed the embryonic stage of his future tactical innovations. Over the months, he frequented the local library in Valence, delving into works on strategy and the history of great commanders. He also maintained regular correspondence with his mother, Letizia, and his brothers, sharing his financial difficulties and hope for promotion. During this period, Napoleon formed friendships with some officers based on the exchange of ideas. His Corsican accent and reserved nature sometimes aroused suspicion, but he managed to find common ground with those who shared his taste for rigor and intellectual debate. While in Garrison, he developed the habit of questioning the organizational methods of the Royal Army, which he found too rigid or too marked by court etiquette. In his view, military discipline should primarily serve efficiency on the field, not perpetuate inherited privileges. This iconoclastic stance already set him apart in the eyes of some of his superiors. In 1786 and 1787, he made several visits to Corsica, sometimes extended, under the pretext of leaves requested from his superiors. There, he reconnected with his roots, got involved in local affairs, and attempted to draw closer to the famous Corsican leader Pasquale Paoli, whom he had admired since childhood. In Ajaccio, Napoleon became interested in the island's politics, dominated by clan rivalries and the issue of autonomy from the French government. This period fed his reflection. He realized that belonging to the French nation was not obvious for many islanders, and he sought a path between loyalty to the monarchy, fidelity to his Corsican homeland, and his aspirations for more freedom. The year 1789 marks a decisive turning point. On July 14th, the storming of the Bastille in Paris, a prison symbolizing the royal power, heralds the beginning of a revolution that will shake all of France. In the months that follow, the privileges of the nobility are abolished, and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen affirms the equality of all before the law. King Louis XVI, initially forced to accept these changes, attempts to flee in 1791, but is arrested. That same year, France adopts a constitutional monarchy. Louis XVI remains king, but his power is limited by a constitution and an assembly elected by the people. In the army, the impact is immediate. The royal authority is challenged, and many high-ranking officers from the old nobility sometimes choose emigration to escape the troubles. Regiments then undergo significant reorganizations, with promotions potentially accelerating for officers willing to serve the new regime. Bonaparte observes these developments cautiously. While he is formally an officer of the king, he is also sensitive to the ideas of the revolution, including equality of opportunity and the dismantling of privileges. However, his position remains ambivalent. He aspires to rise in rank in the French army, which requires swearing allegiance to the civil constitution, then to the new power being established. On the other hand, he remains attached to the Corsican cause. In 1791, Pasquale Paoli returns from exile, welcomed as a hero by the Corsicans. Bonaparte, then a lieutenant on leave, visits him, hoping to play a role in the island's administration. Their relations quickly deteriorate. Paoli, wary of France and fiercely independent, perceives Bonaparte as an opportunist, too oriented towards Paris. Their relationship, initially filled with mutual admiration, transforms into rivalry. Meanwhile, on the continent, the political situation becomes tense. The constitutional monarchy, established in 1791, is weakened by Louis XVI's failed flight to Varennes and by the military intervention of European powers hostile to the revolution. In 1792, France goes to war with Austria, and the French army restructures around more egalitarian principles. Napoleon, already with several years of service under his belt, senses that the moment is ripe for accelerated advancement. He strives to maintain a balance between his involvement in Corsica and his loyalty to the nascent Republican government. On January 21st, 1793, Louis XVI is guillotined in the Place de la Révolution in Paris, marking the definitive end of the monarchy in France. After his execution, a new government, the National Convention, led by the political faction of the Montagnards and dominated by figures like Robespierre, establishes a radical regime. The Republic, now at war with almost all of Europe, enters a phase of intense repression known as the Reign of Terror, where the real or supposed enemies of the new regime are hunted and executed en masse. In this climate of extreme tensions, the situation in Corsica deteriorates. Pasquale Paoli, who had initially supported the revolution, turns against the convention, which he accuses of betraying Corsican interests. He completely breaks away from the revolutionary government and seeks to bring the island closer to the British to ensure its independence. Napoleon is forced to make a choice: stay in Paoli's orbit or embrace the French revolutionary cause. He ultimately opts for the latter, which earns him the animosity of part of the Corsican elite. The clashes on the island intensify in 1793, forcing the Bonaparte family to flee to mainland France. For Napoleon, this painful break seals his fate. He will no longer return to his island homeland as a simple local notable, but will fully integrate into the French Republican project, at least as long as he can benefit from it for his own career. In August 1793, the port city of Toulon, supported by a British fleet commanded by Admiral Hood, rises up against the convention. The local royalists give the British strategic access to the Mediterranean. In response to this situation, the revolutionary government dispatches troops to retake the city, but the resistance proves tenacious. It is in this context that Napoleon Bonaparte, then a mere artillery captain but already noted for his skill, is entrusted with a crucial mission: to organize the artillery to conduct the siege and dislodge the enemy. Arriving on site, Bonaparte notices the lack of cannons and the absence of clear direction. He imposes new discipline and moves the artillery pieces to effectively pound the forts defending the harbor. His strategy is to seize the heights overlooking the port, especially Fort Les Guillettes and the surrounding positions. He writes detailed reports to his superiors, notably Augustin Robespierre, younger brother of Maximilien Robespierre, describing with precision the necessary movements and the expected effect of the artillery. These reports, imbued with a rare confidence for such a young officer, catch attention. The climax occurs in mid-December 1793. Bonaparte gathers the batteries for a final assault against the fortifications defended by the Anglo-Spanish. Under heavy fire, he manages to advance his artillery enough to force the enemy to evacuate the harbor. Wounded in the left thigh during the assault on Fort Les Guillettes, he refuses to leave the battlefield before victory. When the British and Spaniards withdraw, the city of Toulon falls back into the hands of the Convention. It is a major success for the Republic, and Bonaparte's name appears prominently in the official reports. In reward for his decisive role, Napoleon is promoted to the rank of Brigadier General on December 22, 1793, at just 24 years old. This hierarchical leap, exceptional in the French army of the time, illustrates the confidence placed in him by the representatives on mission. In the revolutionary climate, where meritocracy is slowly emerging, Bonaparte's youth and energy are seen as assets. In the following months, he associates with influential figures of the regime, earning the esteem of personalities like Paul Barras and other members of the Committee of Public Safety. After the execution of Robespierre in July 1794, the revolution enters a new phase, the Reign of Terror. This period, marked by numerous arrests and executions in the name of the Republic, ends. France, weary of the violence, seeks to regain a certain stability. A new government, called the Directory, is established. It replaces the former very radical revolutionary regime and tries to calm tensions. But the situation remains complicated. Royalists, who want to restore the monarchy, attempt to regain power. Moderate Republicans, who wish for a more stable republic without a return to monarchy, oppose them. During this period, Bonaparte is temporarily sidelined because he was close to some revolutionaries who fell from grace after the fall of Robespierre. However, thanks to his connections and recognized talent, he doesn't remain in the shadows for long. He quickly manages to regain an important place in the army and politics, notably by drawing closer to the new leaders of the Directory. On October 5, 1795, a royalist insurrection breaks out in Paris. Thousands of insurgents, supporters of a return to monarchy, march on the convention to invest it and overthrow the Republican government. Paul Barras, in charge of the defense of the convention, seeks a competent officer capable of reacting quickly. He recalls the siege of Toulon, where Bonaparte had displayed formidable determination. He hastily summons him, grants him command of the defense, and gives him carte blanche to save the Republic from a potential royalist coup. Napoleon, who never hesitates when firmness is required, skillfully places his artillery at the outskirts of the Saint-Roch church and in the adjacent streets. When the insurgents advance, he orders grape-shot fire, scattering the royalist columns in a terrifying crash. Estimates diverge on the exact toll, but it is believed that several hundred insurgents were killed or wounded, while the Republican camp suffered few losses. The psychological impact is immense. The uprising is crushed within hours, and the message is clear. The new power will not tolerate any attempt at monarchical restoration. This decisive action, although it cost the lives of many Parisians, definitively establishes Bonaparte's reputation with the Directory. The leaders appreciate the speed and cool efficiency with which he faced the royalist threat. Barras, in particular, is full of praise for the Corsican general. He is then promoted to the rank of division general and appointed commander-in-chief of the Army of the Interior, a position that grants him considerable military authority in metropolitan France. For a man barely 26 years old, this promotion is unprecedented. In popular circles, the name Bonaparte begins to circulate. Some see him as a savior of the Republic, the one who stopped the royalist wave. Others denounce a bloody repression, marking a return to state violence. The main person concerned knows that he has just crossed a crucial stage. For the first time, he exercises command at the top and benefits from strong political support. In his letters, he shows awareness of the unique opportunity before him. The Directory, while fearing his ambitious nature, counts on him to quell potential revolts and restore republican order. At the end of 1795, the French Republic is still at war with Austria and its allies. Hostilities are mainly concentrated on two main fronts. On one side, the Rhine Valley, where the armies of the Rhine and Sambre-Meuse face Austrian forces. On the other, Piedmont and Lombardy, where the Army of Italy seeks to contain the Austro-Sardinian troops. The Directory, eager to defend the new borders and ease the Rhine front, decides to intensify the campaign in Italy to fix as many enemy forces there as possible. However, the Army of Italy, stationed in the southeast of France and engaged in the Alpine valleys, is long considered the Cinderella of the Republican forces. It sorely lacks food, equipment, and wages. Its official strength is about 38,000 men, but many desertions and illnesses, in reality, reduce its potential. On the opposing side, the Austrians, allied with the Kingdom of Sardinia, can count on more numerous and better equipped forces, perhaps 50,000 men or more, according to estimates. At first glance, the balance of forces does not favor the French. It is in this context that the Directory appoints Napoleon Bonaparte as Commander-in-Chief of the Army of Italy as of March 2nd in 1796. The choice might surprise. Other, more experienced generals sought this post. But Bonaparte has already established strong political ties, and he impresses with his confidence. His very recent marriage, on March 9th, 1796, to Josephine de Beauharnais, widow of a noble guillotined during the Terror, brings him even closer to the directorial circle. In Barras's eyes, he is the ideal man to lead a dynamic campaign, far from Parisian intrigues. The objectives for Napoleon are multiple: distract the Austrians from the Rhine front, obtain resources for the Republic, and above all, restore France's prestige by inflicting spectacular defeats on its enemies. When Bonaparte arrives at the headquarters in Nice, he finds a discouraged army, poorly clothed, underfed, and with very low morale. Some soldiers have not received pay for months, and the ranks include many convalescent officers whose health is precarious. The officers themselves are skeptical about waging battle beyond the Alps under such conditions. And yet, this ailing army is about, under Bonaparte's impulse, to enter history as one of the most formidable forces of the revolutionary period. From his first speech to the troops, the new commander-in-chief strikes a strong chord. He promises them glory and riches if they agree to follow him. The formula is simple but powerful. He knows that the prospect of loot in Italian lands reputed for their wealth can galvanize the men. Soldiers, you are poorly fed, almost naked. I will lead you into the most fertile plains in the world, he declares to sum up his plan. Beyond simple rhetoric, Bonaparte intends to sustain his army on the conquered land, which, in concrete terms, means sourcing resources directly from occupied territories or conquered cities. While this system is criticized for its plundering aspect, it has the merit of relieving the Republic's finances and maintaining the motivation of soldiers, now convinced they can escape misery by winning victories. The transformation of morale is swift. The men, initially wary, are won over by the infectious energy of their young general. The officers who will become his loyal lieutenants, André Masséna, Pierre Augereau, Jean Lannes, and Louis-Alexandre Berthier, witness Bonaparte's fierce determination and his ability to make quick, sometimes bold decisions. Very quickly, he imposes a steady marching pace, avoids getting bogged down in protracted sieges, and seeks direct confrontation to surprise the enemy. In April 1796, the army of Italy began to move. The first victories came quickly, notably against the Piedmontese at Montenotte, April 12th, and Millesimo, April 14th. Then against the Austrians at Dago, April 15th. However, the symbolic battle that marked a decisive turning point in the collective imagination was that of Lodi on May 10th, 1796. The enemy, commanded by the Austrian general Sebottendorf, occupied the approaches to the bridge over the Adda. The French, outnumbered, could have settled for a classic and cautious maneuver. But Bonaparte, determined to win quickly, ordered a frontal attack on the bridge. Despite the heavy fire from the Austrian artillery, his men, led by Bonaparte's personal example of advancing, crossed in an almost suicidal rush. The Austrians, surprised by this audacity, retreated and abandoned Lodi. The French losses were not negligible, but the victory was complete, and the psychological impact was immense. Napoleon later recounted that at Lodi, he was sure of being able to accomplish great things, as his troops showed exceptional courage against a seasoned adversary. He earned the nickname of Petit Caporal, an affectionate sobriquet highlighting his closeness to his soldiers. After Lodi, the advance continued into the Milanese territory, forcing the Kingdom of Sardinia to negotiate a separate peace. Milan fell into French hands, followed by Mantua, which was besieged but stubbornly defended by the Austrians. During the summer of 1796, Austria sent several expeditionary corps to attempt to relieve Mantua and push back Bonaparte. One of the most memorable clashes took place on the small bridge of Arcole, near Verona, from November 15th to 1796. The Austrian forces were numerically superior. Some figures cite up to 24,000 Austrians against 15,000 French, but Bonaparte relied on mobility and surprise. He feigned a movement to lure the enemy into a marshy area, then launched a fierce frontal attack. During the fighting, Bonaparte is said to have seized a flag to encourage his men and almost got carried away into the mud of a ditch. Several French generals were wounded, and the outcome remained uncertain for several hours. But French energy and tenacity eventually prevailed. Popular legend would mostly remember the image of Napoleon brandishing a tricolor flag to galvanize the troops, a symbol of revolutionary exaltation and individual heroism in the service of the collective. The Battle of Rivoli in January 1797 definitively sealed Bonaparte's tactical superiority over the Austrian army in Italy. As Austria attempted a new offensive to relieve Mantua, Napoleon anticipated the enemy's movements. He positioned himself on the heights of Rivoli, a strategic plateau that allowed him to dominate the valley and monitor the approaches. The Austrians, divided into several columns, were caught off guard and found themselves powerless against the concentration of French force. The battle quickly turned in Bonaparte's favor, who encircled and annihilated a significant portion of the Austrian corps. In total, several thousand Austrian soldiers were taken prisoner, while the French captured artillery and munitions in abundance. This victory granted Bonaparte a reputation of military genius among European observers. According to his officers, he was capable of planning 3 or 4 scenarios in advance, always anticipating a fallback route or a surprise maneuver. His art of war relied on the alliance of rapid marches, the concentration of artillery on a precise point, and the ability to disperse enemy forces before they could coordinate. On the human level, he relied on talented generals like André Masséna, whom he sometimes called the favored child of victory, or Berthier, whose efficiency at headquarters was crucial for executing his orders swiftly. As these battles unfold, Bonaparte's fame grows exponentially. The victory bulletins, carefully written and addressed to Paris, present the young general as an infallible strategist, a leader close to his troops, and a man of rare audacity. The Directory, initially thrilled by the avalanche of successes, nonetheless becomes wary of his growing popularity. The French people, weary of political instability and misery, see in Bonaparte a charismatic figure capable of embodying national grandeur. For now, the directors are pleased with the material resources sent from Italy in the form of war contributions and art objects, though some among them begin to fear that Bonaparte may become too powerful. The courts of Europe, meanwhile, watch as this revolutionary general disrupts the traditional rules of war. It is reported that he deals directly with local authorities, negotiates armistices, and imposes substantial indemnities, using pragmatism more than classical diplomatic principles. The Austrian aristocracy views unfavorably the arrival in Vienna of French emissaries, now laden with military trophies. Above all, the victories in Italy grant the French Republic significant clout in negotiating a comprehensive peace treaty. Ultimately, it is Bonaparte himself who takes charge of concluding hostilities with Austria. Partially ignoring the Directory's directives, who had asked him to wait for the results on the Rhine front, he accelerates the talks and signs the Treaty of Campo Formio on October 17, 1797. This treaty profoundly redraws the map of Italy. Venice and its territories are divided between France and Austria. Lombardy remains under French influence, and new sister republics are established in the peninsula: Cisalpine Republic, Ligurian Republic. For the first time, Bonaparte acts as a quasi-dictatorial political figure. He decides on peace, sets the borders, imposes his vision of alliances, and the French state is thereby enriched with new possessions. The directors, aware of Bonaparte's growing popularity, wish to keep him away from the metropolis to prevent a potential coup. They also seek to strike at Great Britain, the main rival in commercial and colonial matters, without directly facing the powerful Royal Navy in the English Channel. The Egyptian project thus presents itself as a solution to several problems. On one hand, it allows for countering British influence in the Middle East. By seizing Egypt, France threatens the route to India, so crucial for British trade, and hopes to destabilize London's commercial exchanges with its Asian colonies. On the other hand, it offers Napoleon a prestigious and distant field of action while keeping him at a distance from French domestic politics. Finally, it satisfies the young general's appetite for glory, as he harbors vast ambitions. An admirer of Alexander the Great, he already imagines extending the expedition to the gates of India and leaving his mark on a land steeped in history and symbols. The Directory officially approves the plan at the beginning of 1798. An imposing fleet, escorting an army of about 35,000 soldiers, sets sail from Toulon and southern ports on May 19, 1798. Along the way, the expedition stops in Malta, then under the control of the Knights of Malta. Taken by surprise and outnumbered, the latter quickly surrender. This initial victory boosts the confidence of the officers and soldiers in future success. Everything seems to be going according to Bonaparte's plans, who hopes to conduct a lightning operation to capture Egypt before the intervention of the Royal Navy. On July 1, 1798, the French fleet arrives off the Egyptian coast near Alexandria. The landing, carried out hastily and in scorching heat, meets sporadic resistance from the Mamluks, who effectively control Egypt under the theoretical suzerainty of the Ottoman Empire. The initial clashes are swift and result in a French victory. Alexandria falls without too much difficulty, but Bonaparte immediately faces a major logistical problem. The soldiers, unaccustomed to these climatic conditions, suffer from the scorching sun, lack of potable water, and diseases spreading through the camps. In addition to these material difficulties, the cultural context is also disorienting. The local population, mostly Muslim, perceives the French invasion with suspicion, if not hostility. Despite everything, Napoleon relies heavily on the element of surprise and rapid execution. He orders his columns to advance inland, following the banks of the Nile. The objective is clear: to march on Cairo, the political and economic heart of Mamluk Egypt, to establish a new French authority there. With the military rigor that characterizes him, he sets up a provisional administration in Alexandria, appoints commanders responsible for maintaining order, and tries to reassure the population by proclaiming respect for Islamic religion and local customs. In reality, he mainly hopes to secure the passivity of the Egyptians in order to concentrate most of his forces against the Mamluks. The decisive clash takes place on the road to Cairo near Mbabe against a numerically inferior Mamluk army, but renowned for its courage and equestrian skills. It is estimated that about 6,000 Mamluks prepare to defend their positions against the 20,000 to 25,000 soldiers of the French army, supported by modern artillery. Bonaparte, aware of the fame of this iconic location, is said to have uttered the famous phrase, "From the heights of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down on you." This quotation, even though its exact wording remains subject to historical debate, conveys the desire to galvanize the troops by reminding them of the almost mythical significance of their fight. The battle turns out to be relatively brief. The Mamluks attempt cavalry charges to break the French's formation, but encounter perfectly organized infantry squares. The French lines, tight, shoot down the enemy horsemen before they can engage in close combat. The French artillery, strategically positioned on the flanks, completes sowing panic. In a few hours, the Mamluks retreat, leaving many dead on the battlefield. Cairo then falls without much resistance, opening the doors of Egypt to Napoleon. Beyond the military aspect, this expedition in Egypt is distinguished by the presence of nearly 160 scholars, scientists, and artists embarked by Bonaparte's decision. Known as the Commission of Sciences and Arts, this group includes engineers, botanists, chemists, illustrators, mathematicians, and linguists. Their mission: to study Egyptian civilization, its natural wealth, its monuments, and bring back new knowledge to France. It is within this framework that the famous Rosetta Stone will be discovered in July 1799, unearthed by Lieutenant Bouchard near the town of Rosetta, now Rashid. This fragment of a stele engraved with texts in 3 scripts, hieroglyphic, demotic, and Greek, will later allow Jean-François Champollion to decipher Egyptian hieroglyphs, thus revolutionizing the understanding of ancient Egypt. Despite the scientific enthusiasm and the splendor of some sites visited by the French officers, living conditions remain very difficult for the soldiers. Diseases, notably dysentery and the plague, spread. Medical infrastructures are rudimentary, and the summer heat combines with insufficient supplies to weaken the troops. The officers try to maintain discipline, but the reality on the ground is harsh. Reports frequently mention the complaints of doctors and quartermasters struggling with shortages of medicines, drinking water, and basic food. The great weakness of the Army of the East lies in its control of the seas. Once established on the Egyptian coasts, it becomes vulnerable to intervention by the Royal Navy. This is exactly what happens at the end of July 1798. Admiral Horatio Nelson, after searching for the French fleet at several points in the Mediterranean, spots it at Aboukir, not far from Alexandria. The French ships, commanded by Admiral Brueys, are poorly positioned and insufficiently protected. On August 1st, Nelson launches a daring attack in 2 columns, taking advantage of nightfall to create confusion. The French flagship, L'Orient, explodes during the battle, and many vessels are captured or sunk. Out of a fleet of approximately 13 ships of the line, only a handful managed to escape. This naval defeat, one of the most crushing in French maritime history, completely isolates Bonaparte's army. Deprived of reinforcements and resources from the mainland, they find themselves stranded in Egypt, forced to live off the land and rely on the conquered territories. On a strategic level, Nelson's success causes a sensation in Europe. Great Britain and the other coalition powers are delighted to see Bonaparte trapped in his own eastern snare. Far from being discouraged, Napoleon decides to make the best of his situation in Egypt. He seeks to extend his influence towards the Levant, possibly to threaten the Ottoman Empire and potentially open a route to India. In February 1799, he launches an expedition into Syria, hoping to rally some local populations hostile to the Sublime Porte to his cause. The beginnings seem promising. The French take El Arish, then Gaza and Jaffa, in March 1799. However, the Ottoman resistance and the harsh climate quickly slow the advance. The siege of Acre, defended by Pasha Djezer and supported by British ships, turns into a failure. Siege cannons are absent, the plague ravages the French ranks, and the arrival of Ottoman reinforcements forces Bonaparte to lift the camp. On the way back, in the vicinity of Jaffa, the French army experiences a dramatic situation. Besides the disease that continues to strike, controversies arise over the fate of Ottoman prisoners. Several accounts mention the execution of hundreds of prisoners deemed irrecoverable or too dangerous, an episode whose memory remains controversial. Exhausted and discouraged by this setback, Bonaparte brings his weakened troops back to Egypt to consolidate defenses against a possible Turkish counterattack. Despite the propaganda he spreads from Cairo, Bonaparte understands that the situation is deteriorating. The Ottomans are preparing a new offensive, and France, on its part, is plunged into political turmoil that weakens the Directory. Kept informed by couriers and spies, Napoleon feels that his presence could be decisive for the future of the Republic. He then makes a radical decision to leave Egypt in secret in August 1799, with a small group of loyal followers, leaving the command of the army to General Kleber. On board a few frigates evading the vigilance of the navy, Bonaparte crosses the Mediterranean and lands in Provence at the end of September, almost without incident. The abandonment of the Army of the Orient by its leader raises sharp criticisms, especially as the situation in Egypt remains perilous. Kleber, observing the growing hostility of the population and the strengthening of Ottoman troops, even negotiates an evacuation convention, the Convention of El Arish, January 1800, which ultimately fails due to the British Navy. This is followed by Kleber's tragic death, assassinated in Cairo in June 1800, and a long agony of the French army, until its final capitulation in 1801. But during this time, Napoleon will have already fulfilled his destiny on the other side of the Mediterranean by overthrowing the Directory to seize power. When Bonaparte lands in France in October 1799, he discovers a country in the grip of instability. The Directory, weakened by internal divisions and unpopular due to the economic crisis, struggles to maintain order. The war with the Second Coalition proves more difficult than expected, and the victories of the Republic have given way to a certain weariness. Royalists plot to restore the monarchy of the Bourbon family, the dynasty to which Louis XVI, the king guillotined in 1793, belonged. Meanwhile, the Jacobins, an influential political group during the French Revolution, advocate a return to the most radical revolutionary principles. In this troubled situation, many see in Bonaparte a possible savior, the providential man, capable of restoring the authority of the state and bringing peace. Among the main architects of this change are Abbé Sieyès, an influential political theorist, famous for his pamphlet, What is the Third Estate, and Charles-Maurice de Talleyrand-Périgord, a former bishop turned diplomat, renowned for his political adaptability and calculating mind. Both believe that the constitution upon which the Directory rests is unsuitable for the circumstances, and that power should be concentrated in the hands of a few strong men. When they see Bonaparte returning, crowned with his military prestige, they discern in him the ideal instrument for a coup d'état. The negotiations are discreet, so as not to alarm the directors still in place, nor the legislative assemblies such as the Council of Elders and the Council of 500. Sieyès, himself elected director, prepares the ground by securing the support of key officers. Talleyrand, for his part, leverages his vast network to rally influential figures, ready to accept a change of regime as long as it occurs without too much brutality. The plan is to emphasize a supposed Jacobin insurrection to justify the relocation of the legislative body to Saint-Cloud. On November 9, 1799, the councils meet in this castle, while Bonaparte deploys his troops in the vicinity. The first day passes without major incident, but the next day, tension rises. The Council of 500, meeting in the Orangery, suspects the general of wanting to seize power. Inside, Bonaparte, though seasoned by his campaigns, appears clumsy and is almost overwhelmed by the hostility of the deputies who accuse him of treason. It is reported that he stumbles, is jeered at, and owes his salvation to the intervention of his brother Lucien Bonaparte, then president of the Council of 500. Lucien, revolver in hand, exits the Orangery and harangues the grenadiers, claiming that some deputies are threatening to kill Napoleon. The soldiers, already devoted to the general's cause, intervene and forcibly disperse the council. The deputies flee, abandoning the place to the conspirators. Shortly thereafter, a text proclaims the dissolution of the Directory and the creation of a new provisional government, entrusted to 3 consuls, Sieyès, Roger Ducos, and Bonaparte. The latter, bolstered by his prestige, quickly dominates his 2 colleagues. De facto, he becomes the strongman of France. Upon assuming leadership of the consulate, Bonaparte embarks on a major undertaking, the reorganization of the state apparatus. Indeed, the revolutionary years had dismantled administrations, fragmented local powers, and bred a certain distrust towards any form of centralization. To ensure the government's effectiveness and establish his authority over the entire country, Napoleon initiates a drastic re-centralization. The law of February 17, 1800, reinstates the administrative structures on a pyramidal model. The country is divided into departments, each under the responsibility of a prefect appointed by the First Consul. These prefects become the essential cogs of the state, responsible for relaying the central government's will and coordinating public action in their territories. They oversee police, taxation, education, and the flow of goods and people. The principle is clear: a strong man at the head of each department, directly dependent on the executive power. For Napoleon, it is the guarantee of maintaining unity and quashing any potential for local rebellion. In 1800, he creates the Bank of France to stabilize the currency and strengthen the nation's finances. At that time, France was emerging from a period of great financial instability due to the revolution. This new bank is financed by private investors with a capital of 30 million francs, representing approximately 9 tons of gold in value. It is granted the exclusive right to print money in France, preventing the monetary disorders of the past. The Bank of France also acts as a lender to the government, reassuring businesses and merchants who had lost faith in the economy. With this institution, the French state now possesses a powerful tool to control the economy and finance public expenditures, especially the wars Napoleon would wage across Europe. Napoleon, in the same vein, creates or restructures several institutions. Established as early as 1799, the State Council is conceived as an assembly of jurists and administrators tasked with advising the government, preparing draft laws, and overseeing their implementation. The masters of requests and the auditors who make up its ranks form a technical elite, often coming from the educated bourgeoisie, committed to order and merit. Legislative and regulatory issues are debated here, providing the First Consul with invaluable intellectual and technical support to carry out reforms. To successfully implement this program of transformations, Napoleon maintains a legendary work pace. Many accounts highlight this. He sleeps very little, sometimes 3 to 4 hours a night, and demands his collaborators be available at any time. It is not uncommon for him to summon ministers or advisors in the middle of the night to review a decree or discuss a legislative text. He dictates his correspondence to several secretaries simultaneously, correcting drafts with a pen as he goes, and is not hesitant to demand numerous versions until the wording seems perfect to him. This laborious frenzy helps shape his aura. The head of state, far from resting on the trappings of power, is a true workaholic, attentive to the smallest details, endowed with an exceptional memory for figures and people. Some of his collaborators, exhausted, claim to both admire and fear this uncompromising boss, capable of violently losing his temper if a dossier is not completed on time. One of the new regime's priorities is to restore civil peace after a decade of clashes, revolts, and religious wars in certain regions, like the Vendée. For Napoleon, internal stability is essential to reorganize society and mobilize the country's energy in the inevitable external conflicts. Therefore, he shows conciliation towards certain factions, provided they submit to his authority. A major gesture is made on the religious front. Relations between the Catholic Church and the Republic had been abysmal since the civil constitution of the clergy in 1790 and the persecution of many refractory priests. The clergy's properties had been nationalized, and the Catholic worship declared incompatible with revolutionary principles. Napoleon, while remaining faithful to the revolution's legacy, believes it is necessary to re-establish religious peace to soothe believers. Therefore, he engages in negotiations with Pope Pius VII, leading to the signing of the Concordat on July 15, 1801. Under this agreement, Catholicism once again becomes the religion of the vast majority of the French, without being the state religion. The government appoints bishops, who are then recognized by the Pope, and the state commits to paying the clergy's salaries. In return, the Church officially renounces its claims to confiscated properties. This skillful compromise partly satisfies Catholics, who regain legal status, and reassures believers weary of de-Christianizing excesses. For his part, Napoleon gains legitimacy. He poses as the protector of worship, a guarantor of religious and social unity. In practice, the Concordat primarily allows the consulate to control the church, appoint bishops loyal to him, and oversee religious education. It's an ideological tool, a means to reconcile the nation, while ensuring that priests preach obedience to the regime. The reception varies by region, but the appeasement is real. France ceases to tear itself apart over religious issues and can focus on implementing other reforms. Beyond religion, Napoleon aims to control public opinion. He imposes strict censorship on the press, does not tolerate writings he deems seditious, and has political circles likely to foment opposition monitored. Simultaneously, he develops a cult of the leader, maintained by official bulletins and the publication of his triumphant speeches. This strategy, coupled with the relative satisfaction of a country in search of order, ensures him broad support. Moreover, on the social front, he skillfully uses symbols: amnesty to certain emigrants willing to swear allegiance, a decree allowing the Chouans to lay down their arms, etc. All these measures aim at the same objective: consolidating internal peace so that the state's machinery can serve the Napoleonic ambition, whether military, diplomatic, or legislative. Among the major projects of the consulate, one of the most notable for posterity remains the drafting of the Civil Code, promulgated in March 1804. The result of a long-term effort, begun during the Revolution but accelerated under the consulate, this collection of laws aims to unify and clarify French private law. Until then, France was a patchwork of local customs, royal ordinances, and variable jurisprudence. Napoleon considered that a modern and powerful state must rely on a readable and coherent law, applicable across the entire territory. The Napoleonic Civil Code is thus based on a system of written and codified law, where laws are clearly defined in a single text and uniformly applied throughout the French territory, thereby eliminating local variations. Conversely, in Commonwealth countries like England, law is based on common law, a system where judges interpret laws based on past decisions rather than a single text. The Civil Code enshrines principles already stated during the Revolution: the equality of citizens before the law, contractual freedom, and respect for private property. It also introduces a common basis of rules on marriage, filiation, divorce, and adoption. For Napoleon, the stability of society rests on family and the guarantee of property rights. By allowing everyone to enjoy their assets without fearing arbitrary challenges, the regime provides itself with the means to ensure social peace. The code is adopted through several successive laws, then consolidated into a unified body. This text will durably inspire many foreign legislations in the 19th century in the countries conquered or allied by France and even beyond. While Bonaparte is fully invested in internal reorganization, he does not neglect the external arena. The peace signed during the Treaty of Campo Formio in 1797 has shattered, and the Second Coalition once again threatens French borders. Austria, supported by Great Britain, intends to regain the upper hand after the debacle of the Italian campaign of 1796-1797. Aware that his political legitimacy rests on his ability to bring back victory, Napoleon decides to strike fast and hard at the head of the new army of reserve. In the spring of 1800, while the Austrians are pushing the French in the Po Valley, Napoleon conceives a daring plan to cross the Alps via the Great St. Bernard Pass, deemed impracticable for an army of more than 40,000 men. Chroniclers of the time describe the immense logistics needed to hoist cannons and wagons over 2,400 meters of altitude. Ingenious sleds hastily designed are used, and hundreds of mules are mobilized. The tactical surprise is total. The Austrians, focused on more usual passages, cannot believe such a maneuver could be possible in such a short time. Within a few days, the Army of Reserve finds itself in Lombardy, directly threatening Austrian communications. The decisive confrontation takes place at Marengo, near the Italian city of Alessandria, in the north of the country, on June 14, 1800. The Austrian general, Michael von Melas, commanding about 28,000 men, attacks the French, about 23,000, under Bonaparte's direct command. The morning ends with an apparent Austrian success. The French line wavers, and Melas thinks he has won the victory, but he neglects to pursue his advantage and returns to his quarters, confident. It is then that French reinforcements led by General Desailly, an officer highly appreciated by Bonaparte, arrive. Sensing the opportunity, he launches a daring counterattack in the late afternoon. The Austrians, surprised and scattered, eventually give way in the face of French determination. Desailly loses his life during the fighting, but Marengo concludes with a spectacular reversal of the situation. This victory strengthens Napoleon's reputation as an unpredictable strategist and bolsters his political position in Paris. The First Consul once again appears as the savior of the country, capable of defying odds and defeating the Republic's adversaries. The feat of crossing the Great St. Bernard Pass inspires many artists, foremost among them Jacques-Louis David. His famous painting, painted between 1800 and 1801, depicts Napoleon on a rearing horse, his cloak fluttering in the wind, pointing toward the summit of the pass. In reality, it is said that Bonaparte actually crossed the pass on a mule, which was safer on this steep terrain. But David's painting seeks to elevate the moment, to capture the image of the conquering leader, master of the mountains and his destiny. This representation, commissioned by Napoleon himself, is part of an early imperial propaganda. It presents a man chosen by destiny, walking in the footsteps of Charlemagne and Hannibal, whose names are carved into the rock on the canvas. The various versions of the painting circulate in Europe at the time, helping to shape the myth of the conquering First Consul. At the end of the consulate, Napoleon Bonaparte already ruled masterfully over the institutions of the Republic. After pacifying the interior with the Concordat and laying down the legislative foundations with the Civil Code, he quickly gained the trust, but also the fear, of a large part of the political class. In 1802, a plebiscite confirmed him at the head of the state with the title of First Consul for life. This decision marked a turning point. In theory, the Republic still existed, but the accumulation of powers around Napoleon ultimately negated the separation of legislative, executive, and judicial powers established after the Revolution. On the domestic front, the Council of State, the Bank of France, and the prefectural network were levers that centralized the country around his person. The efficiency of this new administration, the economic boom in some sectors, and the restoration of civil peace generated genuine popular enthusiasm, reinforced by government propaganda. However, threats persisted. The European monarchies, dissatisfied or defeated, watched for a misstep to restore balance in Europe. In Paris, royalist or Jacobin plots were still forming, sometimes directly targeting the life of the first consul. In 1804, the affair of the Duke of Enghien, a Bourbon prince accused of plotting against Bonaparte and summarily executed, shook public opinion. While the episode shocked certain circles, it nonetheless reinforced Napoleon's authority. His supporters saw it as proof that the enemies of the revolution remained active and that institutions needed to be definitively secured. The Senate, led by personalities loyal to the regime, then voted in favor of transforming the consulate into a hereditary empire. A new plebiscite, carefully organized, overwhelmingly approved this constitutional change. France, weary after 10 years of upheaval, longed for stable and glorious order. Napoleon, now free from any real counterpower, was proclaimed Emperor of the French under the name Napoleon III in the spring of 1804. To many, this was merely the logical continuation of his trajectory. The man who restored national prestige, reformed the state apparatus, and triumphed over foreign coalitions could only be a sovereign. On December 2nd, 1804, a grand ceremony unfolded in the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, magnificently decorated for the occasion. Flags, tapestries, and golds, specially commissioned, transformed the edifice into a grandiose theater. Pope Pius VII, who had arrived in France a few weeks earlier, attended the ceremony, but his role turned out to be more limited than one might have expected for an imperial coronation. Napoleon was keen to show that, although he sought religious legitimation, he was not dependent on the church. Contemporary witnesses spoke of a massive crowd outside, held back by thousands of soldiers and National Guards. Inside, the political elite, the diplomatic corps, and many close to the new sovereign gathered. The key moment came when Napoleon, after being anointed, took the crown himself and placed it on his own head, demonstrating his desire to be seen as the sole architect of his destiny. The engravings and paintings of the era, particularly those by Jacques-Louis David, present at the event, immortalized this symbolic gesture. The emperor, standing, holding the golden crown with a solemn motion, while Pius VII looks on, almost in the background. Subsequently, Napoleon crowned Josephine, his wife, as Empress of the French. The Bonaparte family, seated on honorary tribunes, partook in the staging. Brothers, sisters, and uncles, all clad in rich fabrics, bore witness to the rise of a dynasty from modest Corsican nobility, now adorned with the most prestigious regalia. Several anecdotes circulate around the ceremony. It is said, for example, that Napoleon meticulously rehearsed the protocol order with the organizers, ensuring every detail, from the music to the seating arrangement. His goal, to imprint in the minds of the people the idea of a majestic coronation, rivaling that of the kings of the Ancien Regime. He also insisted that the attendees stand when he placed the crown on his head, thereby asserting his all-powerful status in front of the clergy. Others recount Josephine's nervousness, fearing that the emperor might hesitate to crown her due to certain marital tensions. It was essential for him to portray a perfect union, even though his marriage to Josephine was experiencing strains, particularly due to the absence of an heir. Ultimately, everything unfolds according to Napoleon's will, and the day of December 2nd, 1804, stands as the founding act of the new empire. The day after the coronation, Napoleon turns immediately to his army, which he establishes as the pillar of the empire. He founds the Imperial Guard. Direct heir to the Consular Guard, this force is not limited to being merely a close guard. It embodies a dual essential function. On the one hand, it ensures the personal protection of the emperor, guaranteeing absolute loyalty to the regime in an era marked by conspiracies and political instabilities. On the other hand, it serves as a strategic reserve on the battlefield, composed of the most seasoned soldiers of the French army. Napoleon understands that to wage his European wars, he needs an elite troop, disciplined and feared, capable of intervening at decisive moments. The Imperial Guard thus becomes a symbol of the military prestige of the empire, but also a formidable tactical lever, whose engagement in combat can overturn the outcome of a battle. Following 1804, the conscription system inherited from the Revolution is strengthened. Each year, levees call tens of thousands of young Frenchmen under the flags. The numbers are staggering. It is estimated that between 1804 and 1814, around 2.5 million men will be incorporated into the Napoleonic armies, a record for the time. The Grande Armee, an emblematic name, groups elite troops and is organized into autonomous corps d'armée, each led by a marshal or a high-ranking general. This structuring allows for rapid operations, the ability to move in multiple columns, and to concentrate on a decisive point during battles. Napoleon appoints a series of marshals, a title resurrected for the occasion, to reward and rank his best officers. Some come from modest backgrounds, a symbol of Napoleonic meritocracy, even though the emperor does not hesitate to distribute titles and endowments to secure their loyalty. While the coronation of December 1804 marks the official birth of the empire, it is truly on the battlefields that Napoleon earns his aura of an invincible emperor. During the period 1805-1807, several spectacular victories etch his name into the collective imagination. New European coalitions formed to counter France, successively regrouping Austria, Russia, Prussia, and the United Kingdom. Yet, on the continent, Napoleon accumulates successes. One year to the day after his coronation, Napoleon faced the combined armies of Emperor Francis II of Austria and Tsar Alexander I of Russia near the village of Austerlitz in Moravia, the present-day Czech Republic. Despite a relative numerical inferiority, around 73,000 French against more than 85,000 Austro-Russians, he lured the enemy into a trap. By pretending to retreat on his right flank, he encouraged the coalition to attack, then launched a lightning offensive at the center to cut their lines. The surprise effect was total. Confusion set in among the Austro-Russian ranks, and the Imperial French army achieved a resounding victory. Reports indicate about 15,000 to 25,000 losses for the coalition, against fewer than 10,000 for the French, although figures vary by source. Austerlitz is a strategic masterpiece. Napoleon celebrated his first imperial anniversary by triumphing over two major powers. Legend even has it that he murmured, gazing at the battlefield, that he was satisfied with his soldiers. In the aftermath, Austria signed the Treaty of Pressburg, December 26, 1805, and temporarily withdrew from the conflict. The Holy Roman Empire, an old medieval structure, was soon dissolved, while Napoleon created the Confederation of the Rhine to better control Western Germany. In 1806, it was Prussia's turn to go to war against France, exasperated by the expansion of the empire along the Rhine. The proud Prussian nobility, confident in its army's reputation since Frederick II, underestimated the capabilities of the Grande Armee. The decisive battles took place at Jena and Auerstedt, two nearby localities, on the same day, October 14, 1806. At Jena, Napoleon faced the main Prussian force, between 45,000 and 55,000 men. Thanks to his maneuvering ability, he flanked the Prussian army, which quickly disintegrated. Meanwhile, Marshal Davout, with barely 26,000 men, heroically withstood the Prussians at Auerstedt, delivering an even more stinging disaster to the enemy. In a matter of hours, Prussia was brought to its knees. The road to Berlin was open, and the Prussian capital fell under French control by the end of October. Europe, amazed, watched as one of the most renowned military kingdoms was swept aside by the Grande Armee. After the Prussian capitulation, Russia remained the ultimate major adversary on the continent. Alexander I attempted to reorganize his forces, but the French advance continued into Poland. The decisive battle took place at Friedland on June 14, 1807, where Napoleon faced a Russian army commanded by General Bennigsen. Once again, the superiority of French maneuvering prevailed. After pinning the enemy with a frontal assault, Napoleon launched an envelopment on the flanks, forcing the Russians to retreat towards the Niemen. The Russian losses were considerable, up to 20,000 men according to some estimates, and Alexander I understood that he could not prevail for the time being. He sought an armistice, leading to the Treaty of Tilsit on July 7th and 9th, 1807, marking a turning point in the European diplomatic landscape. During an interview on a raft in the middle of the Niemen, Napoleon and Alexander III sealed a brief alliance. According to witnesses, the two monarchs complemented each other, with Napoleon seeking to charm the young Tsar, while the latter, impressed by French power, was willing to agree to a sharing of spheres of influence in Europe. This was the peak of Napoleonic glory. In less than 3 years, the Grande Armee had defeated Austria, Russia, and Prussia, reshaping the continent. In Paris, the emperor was hailed as a nearly invincible hero, heralding a new order. In 1806, Napoleon implemented the Continental Blockade, a strategy aimed at economically asphyxiating England, his main adversary in Europe. Since the beginning of the Napoleonic Wars, Great Britain remained elusive. Protected by its naval power, it financed coalitions against France and supplied its allies with weapons and resources. Unable to confront it directly at sea after the defeat at Trafalgar in 1805, Napoleon chose another path: to strike the British economy by prohibiting European countries under his control from trading with it. The objective was clear: to deprive England of its markets and raw materials, forcing it to negotiate peace. But this strategy faced many obstacles, including smuggling and opposition from some nations dependent on British trade. While the blockade weakened the English economy, it also harmed France and its allies, contributing, in the long run, to the isolation and weakening of the Napoleonic Empire. Proud of his successes, Napoleon hastens to establish his control over vast regions. He creates vassal states, places his relatives on vacant thrones, and imposes a political reorganization tailored to his interests. He establishes several satellite kingdoms under his direct control or entrusted to members of his family. The Kingdom of Italy, where Napoleon is crowned king in Milan in 1805, allows him to dominate the north of the peninsula. There, he imposes the Napoleonic Code, conscription, and an administration modeled on that of France. In Westphalia, a territory created in 1807 from former Prussian territories and several German principalities, he installs his brother Jerome Bonaparte. The Kingdom of Holland, entrusted to his brother Louis Bonaparte in 1806, allows him to govern the Netherlands. As for the Kingdom of Naples, conquered by the French, it is initially led by Joseph Bonaparte in 1806, before being assigned to Joachim Murat in 1808. In addition to these kingdoms, Napoleon creates and controls various duchies and grand duchies, such as those of Berg or Warsaw, by placing loyalists or family members there. This new geopolitical organization, sometimes called the Napoleonic Map of Europe, illustrates his ambition for a continental empire under French hegemony. From an ideological point of view, Napoleon seeks to spread the modernizing principles of the civil code, strengthen centralized administration, and abolish feudal privileges. However, in reality, local populations often endure the burden of mandatory conscription and the heavy requisitions imposed by the imperial regime. This expansionist policy, dubbed Bonaparte family on the thrones of Europe, inevitably creates tensions. The emperor's brothers are not always up to the task, and some complain about having to implement Napoleon's decisions without any room for maneuver. Louis, for example, wants to govern Holland for the benefit of the Dutch, while Napoleon demands unconditional respect for the continental blockade. Memorable disputes erupt, with Napoleon not hesitating to threaten to depose his own relatives if they contravene the set line. Moreover, in European courts, the traditional nobility looks with dismay at the arrival of Corsican upstarts seizing thrones. Some defeated monarchs privately criticize Napoleon's authoritarianism, but are forced to conclude matrimonial alliances to maintain a semblance of peace. The emperor's prestige, bolstered by his military victories, commands respect or resignation more than genuine consensus. While the army continuously extends the empire's borders, Napoleon continues his work of government in France. Internally, he tightens control mechanisms and willingly imposes a style he describes as enlightened despotism. The Minister of Police, Joseph Fouché, a former revolutionary, runs a formidable network of spies and informants. The emperor tolerates criticism poorly. The press is strictly censored, and opposition papers are banned or monitored. Only a few official newspapers disseminate imperial propaganda, extolling the merits of Napoleon's policies and celebrating every victory. Posters and proclamations maintain the figure of the infallible sovereign, protector of the nation, and restorer of French greatness. The secret police, under Fouché's direction, tracks down plots, real or supposed. It is estimated that hundreds of people are arrested each year for political reasons, whether royalists conspiring to restore the Bourbon or Jacobins accused of egalitarian fomentations. To maintain this authoritarian order, Napoleon relies on the bourgeois elite and the new nobility of empire, composed of marshals, civil dignitaries, and high officials. He bestows titles, count, duke, prince, and endowments, thus recreating an aristocracy loyal, even if it claims to remain faithful to the principles of the revolution. Despite censorship and political repression, the empire undertakes extensive projects. Napoleon is determined to make Paris a capital worthy of his power. Large avenues are developed, and monuments are erected or embellished. The Arc de Triomphe, initiated in 1806. The Vendôme Column, erected starting in 1806 on the model of Trajan's Column. Imperial roads are developed, facilitating the circulation of goods and military movements. The canal network expands, promoting domestic trade. Thus, France experiences a certain economic boom, even though constant warfare heavily burdens the finances. In parallel, Napoleon encourages the arts. He supports painters like Jacques-Louis David, who creates large canvases celebrating the emperor's glory. Other artists, such as Gros or Ingres, receive official commissions to depict battles or the lavish aspects of the court. Theaters also come under the power's control. Plays exalting patriotism and extolling loyalty to the emperor are staged. But it is in music, with the works of composers like Étienne Nicolas Méhul, that Napoleon's desire to endow France with a martial and heroic repertoire can be perceived. In everyday life, the Parisian people live in the shadow of military glory. Conscripts regularly leave to join the Grande Armee, while families anxiously await news from distant fronts. When a victory occurs, Paris lights up with bonfires, Te Deums resonate in churches, and lavish ceremonies are organized in the Tuileries gardens. The imperial etiquette, rigorously codified by Napoleon and perfected by his sister Pauline or by Empress Josephine, lends receptions a splendor worthy of the Ancien Regime, but even more controlled. Guests must adhere to a strict hierarchy, greet according to their rank, and pass before the emperor with eyes lowered. In 1810, a major change occurs at the court when Napoleon marries Marie-Louise of Austria, daughter of Emperor Francis I. This political marriage, concluded after his divorce from Josephine, aims to strengthen his ties with one of Europe's oldest dynasties, the Habsburgs. By allying with Austria, Napoleon hopes to legitimize his empire in the eyes of European monarchies and ensure a lineage that would consolidate his power. The union is celebrated with great pomp, and Marie-Louise, although initially reluctant, quickly adapts to her new role as empress. Rumors abound at the court. Everyone wants to know who is in favor, who has fallen into disgrace. Confidences are exchanged about matrimonial alliances, tensions among Napoleon's close ones, and the intrigues orchestrated around power. Meanwhile, the mass of Parisians, often modest, accommodates themselves to a regime that provides them with a certain stability after the revolutionary turmoil. Bread remains at a relatively stable price thanks to imperial measures controlling provisions, and small businesses benefit from the comings and goings of officers, diplomats, and foreigners attracted by the grandeur of the imperial capital. The rift between Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I is rooted in the Treaty of Tilsit, 1807. The agreement, concluded on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River, had then sealed a temporary alliance, but the respective ambitions of the two sovereigns could not coexist for long. The continental blockade, decreed by Napoleon to suffocate British trade, demands all European nations break their trade with England. However, Russia, a vast agricultural and commercial empire, suffers economically from this forced closure. Gradually, Alexander III shows reluctance to strictly enforce the blockade, allowing English products to enter his lands, to Napoleon's great displeasure. Moreover, other sources of discord accumulate. Poland, now the Duchy of Warsaw under French protectorate, worries Russia, which fears the revival of a hostile Polish state on its western borders. Furthermore, failed matrimonial alliances fuel grievances. By 1811, the Tsar restricts the application of the blockade, almost officially announcing he will no longer accept Napoleonic hegemony. Bonaparte, in turn, considers this reversal as an affront. For him, a grand expedition into Russian territory is imperative. It is no longer just about exerting pressure on Alexander, but crushing him to permanently consolidate his empire. In June 1812, Napoleon gathered on the banks of the Niemen, the largest military force Europe had ever seen. It is estimated to consist of over 600,000 men, all corps included, about 450,000 French soldiers, supported by allied contingents, Austrians, Saxons, Bavarians, Westphalians, Poles, etc. This extraordinary Grande Armee, divided into several army corps, followed a simple plan: cross the river, penetrate Russia, and deliver the decisive battle that would force Alexander I to negotiate. But Russia is vast, and the Russians practice a strategy of gradual retreat, avoiding frontal confrontation and applying the scorched earth policy. Villages are burned down or stripped of their goods, depriving the Grande Armee of essential resources. The supply lines, already stretched over hundreds of kilometers, struggle to maintain food and forage supplies. Logistical difficulties quickly prove enormous. Every evening, thousands of horses die of hunger or exhaustion. The wounded and sick clog improvised field hospitals, and typhus begins to spread. Moreover, the sweltering heat of the Russian summer surprises the troops. Estimates vary, but it is considered that even before the first major battle, the Grande Armee lost more than 100,000 men through desertion, disease, or simple exhaustion. Finally, the Russians accept battle at Borodino near the Moskva on September 7, 1812. General Kutuzov, appointed commander-in-chief of the Russian forces, awaits the Grande Armee with around 120,000 men. Napoleon then lines up about 130,000 soldiers. The clash is of an unprecedented violence. The fortified Russian positions, notably the Ravsky and Bagration redoubts, fiercely resist the assaults of the French infantry and cavalry. The artillery on both sides creates carnage. Repeatedly, Napoleon hesitates to engage his Imperial Guard, fearing to lose this elite corps. He eventually wins the battle, forcing Kutuzov to retreat towards Moscow. Nevertheless, the victory comes at a high price. French losses are estimated at more than 30,000 men, many of whom are experienced officers, and the Russians lose at least as many, if not more. On a psychological level, Borodino is not a resounding triumph. It is a slaughterhouse that does not destroy the Russian will. Contrary to Napoleon's expectations, Alexander I does not ask for peace. Kutuzov, aware, understands that Russia can sacrifice soldiers and exchange space for time as winter is approaching. On September 14, 1812, Napoleon enters Moscow, the holy city of Russia and symbolic capital, although St. Petersburg is the administrative capital. However, the population has already evacuated. In a strange atmosphere, the Grand Army discovers an almost deserted city. Quickly, fires break out. Most are likely set by Russians, determined to prevent the invaders from finding shelter and provisions. The fire ravages the wooden quarters, spreading at an appalling speed. For several days, Moscow burns, making the occupation almost unbearable. Napoleon waits in vain for an envoy from the Tsar to negotiate peace. In vain. The Russians, at a safe distance, let the enemy become bogged down in a ruined city without supplies. The emperor has to face the facts. He cannot stay in Moscow indefinitely for lack of food for his men and horses. The first frosts already appear, heralding an early winter. After a month of immobility, he finally decides to retreat, hoping to reach more favorable territories where to establish his winter quarters. The retreat begins in October 1812, under extremely difficult conditions. Temperatures drop sharply, often below 20 degrees, sometimes 30 degrees, for which most soldiers of the Grande Armee are not equipped. Often, they only wear the light uniforms of the summer campaign. The horses, already weakened, die by the thousands. The Russians, on their part, harass the retreating column. The Cossacks multiply raids on the flanks, attacking isolated units. In the rearguard, Marshals Ney and Davout attempt to contain the assaults, but continually lose men, equipment, and cannons abandoned for lack of horses to pull them. The situation worsens further during the crossing of the Berezina at the end of November 1812. The bridges are destroyed by the Russians, and the river is half frozen. Napoleon orders his engineers to hastily build makeshift bridges under enemy fire. Thousands of soldiers and civilians are crammed on the banks in total panic. Many drown or freeze to death. Despite everything, a portion of the Grande Armee manages to cross the Berezina, but leaves behind a significant part of its baggage and its men. During this debacle, Napoleon is constantly seeking information on General Maillet's conspiracy in Paris, October 1812. He learns that a plot nearly overthrew his regime, taking advantage of rumors about his death in Russia. Fearing the fragility of his position, he decides to leave his army hastily on December 5, 1812, leaving command to the King of Naples, Joachim Murat. He travels incognito by sleigh to return to Paris as quickly as possible, arriving in mid-December. The contrast is striking between the capital, which has remained relatively calm, and the apocalyptic scene of the retreat, where survivors, chilled and demoralized, returned to France in small, skeletal groups. Of the more than 600,000 men who set out, it is estimated that fewer than 100,000 return in combat-ready condition, a figure that includes soldiers wounded or ill to varying degrees. The catastrophe of Russia is a national trauma, shattering the myth of Napoleonic invincibility. Taking advantage of the French weakening, European powers regroup once again into a sixth coalition. United Kingdom, Russia, Prussia, and Sweden, joined by Austria in 1813, all determined to bring down Napoleon. Great Britain continues to finance this alliance, while Russian armies, invigorated by their defensive victory, march westward. Prussia, humiliated in 1806 at Jena, seeks to take its revenge. King Frederick William III encourages patriotic revolt, sparking a national movement to drive out the French. As for Austria, it eventually turns against its son-in-law Napoleon, seeing in his Russian defeat an opportunity to restore its own status in Europe. In the spring of 1813, Napoleon attempts to hastily rebuild a new army by decreeing massive levies of conscripts, sometimes only 17 or 18 years old, called the Mairie Louise. The lack of experienced officers is painfully felt, as many have perished or been taken prisoner in Russia. Unfortunately, even though Napoleon still achieves some successes, like at Lutzen, May 2, 1813, and Bautzen, May 20-21, 1813, he no longer has the same tactical superiority. The coalition armies learn from past mistakes, strive to coordinate their movements, and benefit from increasingly large numbers. A major turning point occurs from October 16th to 19th, 1813, in Leipzig, Saxony. Nicknamed the Battle of Nations, it pits more than 200,000 French and allies against about 300,000 soldiers of the coalition: Russians, Prussians, Austrians, Swedes. For 4 days, fierce combat rages around the city. Napoleon, lacking cavalry to protect his lines, suffers constant pressure from enemy waves. The King of Saxony, initially an ally of France, defects in the midst of the battle, joining the opposing camp. This betrayal hastens the debacle. The main bridge blows up before all French troops can retreat, trapping part of the army in the city. The losses are staggering, an estimated 100,000 dead or wounded on both sides. Leipzig seals the end of Napoleon's dominance in Germany. The states of the Confederation of the Rhine quickly detach themselves from the French Empire. The coalition forces march westward, crossing the Rhine at the end of 1813. France finds itself invaded for the first time since the Revolutionary Wars. Peace negotiations remain fruitless, as Napoleon refuses to return to the 1792 borders. He still wants to retain his influence in some annexed territories, but the enemy demands the dismantling of his empire. As the situation worsens, Napoleon sees more of his allies abandoning him. The kings placed on European thrones, even his own brothers, attempt to negotiate their continued power with the coalition, sacrificing their loyalty to the emperor to avoid the worst. The marshals themselves, exhausted by a decade of wars, begin to doubt the possibility of salvaging the situation. They have seen their best regiments decimated in Russia, at Leipzig, and know that French forces are now vastly outnumbered. Murat, King of Naples, secretly negotiates with Austria. Bernadotte, a former marshal of Napoleon who became heir to the Swedish throne, is now fighting with the coalition. Fouché, Minister of Police, maneuvers to secure a position in a future without Napoleon. The fatigue spreads throughout French society, which suffers under the unbearable burden of conscription and war taxes. In January 1814, the coalition armies cross the Rhine and penetrate French territory. Napoleon, despite his reduced forces, about 70,000 men against more than 200,000 for the coalition, conducts a brilliant defensive campaign, winning several unexpected victories through his mastery of maneuver and the speed of his light infantry. These successes, called the Campaign of France, further demonstrate the emperor's tactical genius, but are not enough to halt the enemy's advance. The coalition coordinates to converge on Paris, determined to force Napoleon into capitulation. On March 30th, 1814, the Battle of Paris begins. Marshals Mortier and Marmont try to defend the capital, but are overwhelmed by the Russian and Prussian numerical superiority. The next day, the city surrenders without being sacked, as the authorities prefer to avoid a massacre. Napoleon, then en route to rescue the capital, can only witness the surrender. The coalition occupies Paris, where Alexander Therms and Frederick William III make a noticeable entry. The Parisian people, exhausted by the wars, oscillate between resignation and curiosity towards these victorious sovereigns. Faced with the occupation of the capital, several marshals urge the emperor to negotiate. They persuade him that it is impossible to continue the war, as France itself no longer supports him in this endeavor. The coalition representatives indicate they will refuse any peace as long as Napoleon remains in power. On the night of April 4th, 1814, during a council assembled at Fontainebleau, the marshals and ministers demand his abdication. Napoleon, initially ready to continue the fight, finally gives in. On April 6, 1814, he abdicates in favor of his son, the Aiglon, Napoleon II, whom he had with Marie-Louise of Austria. But the coalition does not recognize this hereditary transfer and demands a total renunciation. Thus, on April 11, 1814, Napoleon signs the final act of his unconditional abdication. According to the terms of the Treaty of Fontainebleau, Napoleon retains the title of emperor, but is limited to the island of Elba, a small Mediterranean island off the coast of Tuscany. He is granted an annual allowance, supposed to be paid by France, and a detachment of guards to ensure his protection. Accompanied by a few loyal supporters, he lands on the island in May 1814. Quickly, he organizes a reduced court. He sets up residences, creates a rudimentary administration, has roads paved, and gardens cultivated. Observers and diplomats present report that the former master of Europe is busy modernizing the island as if it were a new kingdom. At the same time, he follows the news from France, hoping for a change of situation. In Paris, the news of Napoleon's departure arouses mixed feelings. Relief among many families weary of wars. Concern among certain popular circles still attached to the imperial myth, joy among royalists, who see this abdication as the end of the revolution. The Allies restore the Bourbon dynasty in the person of Louis XVIII, brother of Louis XVI, who was guillotined in 1793. The new king takes possession of the Tuileries and promises a constitutional regime. However, distrust towards this sovereign, who was exiled throughout the revolution, remains. The French, weary, accept a transition, but enthusiasm for the monarchical restoration remains limited, especially in the army where many regret past glories. Alert to political developments, he learns that the new regime, the restoration of the Bourbons under Louis XVIII, disappoints or worries many French. Former military personnel sidelined, peasants fearing the return of tithes and privileges, empire supporters frustrated. Also informed of the quarrels between European powers, he senses that he can seize his chance by landing by surprise. On February 26, 1815, taking advantage of the relative leniency of the small French fleet supposed to monitor him, Napoleon discreetly boards a brig, L'Inconstant, accompanied by about 700 loyalists, grenadiers of the guard, officers, servants. Some auxiliary vessels complete the expedition, carrying equipment and ammunition. Evading the Royal Navy, he reaches the coast of Provence on March 1st at the Gulf of Juan, near Antibes. This choice is motivated by the geographical situation. The southern routes are less monitored, and the political climate in the region is considered more favorable, at least not as fiercely royalist as in Marseille or Toulon. As soon as he sets foot on mainland territory, Napoleon hoists the tricolor flag, a symbol of the revolution and the empire, and issues an impassioned proclamation to announce his return. The few local policemen exhibit surprise, even hesitation. The peasants, curious, recognize him by his gray coat and bicorn hat. News spreads rapidly. The emperor is back. The royal authorities react with incredulity, initially not believing the feasibility of such an escape. Louis XVI orders troops to block Napoleon, but events spin out of his control. Determined to reach the capital, Napoleon sets off through the Alps. The royal troops mobilize. The king dispatches the 5th Line Regiment, commanded by Colonel Labédoyère, to stop the usurper. But when Napoleon encounters these soldiers at Laffrey, on March 7th, a famous reversal occurs. The legend has it that he advances alone, opens his coat, and calls out to the troops, "Soldiers, if there is one among you who wishes to kill his emperor, here I am." Surprised and moved, the soldiers, instead of shooting, throw down their arms and cheer for Napoleon. Labédoyère unhesitatingly joins the imperial camp. This scene, considerably romanticized by propaganda, symbolizes the captivating power the eagle still holds over the French army, nurtured by memories of imperial glory. From then on, Napoleon's march towards Paris takes on the allure of a triumphal procession. The units sent to stop him successively rally, sometimes including officers still attached to the ideals of 1799-1804 or nostalgic for victory campaigns. From villages cheering Napoleon to bewildered royalist officers, everyone realizes that Louis XVIII's regime is faltering due to a lack of popular support in the army. As he nears the capital, the number of soldiers and volunteers swells his ranks. The aristocratic elites and royal court, seized by panic, urge the king to flee. On the night of March 19 to 20, Louis XVIII leaves Paris hastily for Belgium. On March 20th, Napoleon enters the Tuileries amid an exultant crowd. The 100 days begin. As soon as he returned to Paris, Napoleon strove to restore the empire. He reinstated Napoleonic symbols, the tricolor flag, the imperial eagle, the Napoleonic Code. He published an additional act to the constitutions of the empire, meant to give a more liberal color to the regime to appeal to public opinion. Press freedoms were partially relaxed, and he claimed to want to reconcile with all the forces of the country, but his room for maneuver was limited. Domestically, the memory of past wars tired more than a few, and the state's finances were depleted. Above all, the European monarchs gathered at the Congress of Vienna to redraw post-Napoleonic Europe, unequivocally condemned this unexpected return. They declared Napoleon outlawed and formed a new coalition to crush him. In fact, the Allied nations had never completely let their guard down. Austria, Russia, Prussia, and the United Kingdom maintained powerful armies ready to intervene if Napoleon once again upset the continent's balance. Tsar Alexander I, who once allied with Bonaparte, was uncompromising. Austria, whose Archduchess, Marie-Louise Napoleon had married, did not hesitate to consider this union void. Only Bavaria, once supported by Napoleon, adopted a more ambiguous attitude, but overall, the coalition reformed. Allied diplomats ended their differences to concentrate their efforts against the reborn emperor. Inside the country, the visible enthusiasm during the march from Gulf Juan to Paris did not translate everywhere into unconditional support. The peasants on one side feared a return to massive conscription. The business circles on the other dreaded the consequences of another war on commerce. The Republicans distrusted an imperial regime deemed authoritarian, despite promises of greater freedoms. Nevertheless, Napoleon managed to rally a considerable part of the French army. He committed to recalling former empire officers, rebuilding his Imperial Guard. He flattered patriotic sentiments, portraying Louis XVI as a ruler imposed by foreigners. The men remembered the great victories of the past, and the prospect of regaining national honor by defending the country against the coalition fueled a resurgence of fervor. In 3 months, Napoleon succeeded in assembling around 200,000 soldiers, far fewer than during the glory days, but still numerous enough to fight some crucial battles. He knew, however, that time was pressing, the coalition was organizing, and the summer of 1815 would be decisive. Aware of the need to strike quickly, Napoleon devised a bold plan to divide his adversaries before they could concentrate against him. The British armies, commanded by the Duke of Wellington, deployed in Belgium, while the Prussians, under Field Marshal Blücher, also approached this area. Napoleon decided to strike these two forces separately before their junction could be completed. He hoped to repeat the tactic of the Napoleonic battle, surprising his enemies, defeating them in successive engagements, and then imposing his political will. In mid-June 1815, the French army crossed the Belgian border. The first confrontations took place at the battles of Ligny and Quatre Bras on June 16, 1815. At Ligny, Napoleon inflicted a serious defeat on the Prussians, forcing them to retreat. Meanwhile, Marshal Ney faced Wellington at Quatre Bras without achieving a decisive victory. The Prussians withdrew in disarray, but were not annihilated. Napoleon made the mistake of not pursuing them vigorously enough, relying on his lieutenant, Marshal Grouchy, to contain them. Meanwhile, Wellington fell back in good order to a strategic position south of Brussels, near the village of Waterloo. On the morning of June 18, 1815, Napoleon deployed his army facing Wellington's forces, solidly positioned on the Mont Saint-Jean plateau. The troops were roughly balanced, about 70,000 French soldiers against 68,000 Anglo-Dutch, supported by a Hanoverian German contingent. Most importantly, Wellington benefited from well-positioned artillery and terrain generally favorable to defense, slightly sloping, with fortified farms like La Haye-Sainte and Hougoumont. Napoleon hoped that Grouchy would keep the Prussians away from the battlefield, allowing him to defeat Wellington before any possible reinforcements arrived. However, the emperor was unaware that Blücher, despite his defeat at Ligny, was resolutely marching toward Waterloo to aid Wellington. Weather played a decisive role. The day before, heavy rain had fallen on the region, turning the ground into muddy terrain. French cannons, less maneuverable in the mud, fired with difficulty, and the infantry advanced laboriously. Napoleon then delayed until late morning to let the ground dry, which gave Wellington precious hours to fortify further and, critically, brought the potential arrival of the Prussians closer. The battle seriously commenced in the early afternoon. The French attacked the farms of Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte, seeking to break through the enemy lines. The fighting was fierce. At Hougoumont, the British Guards and Allied troops held firm despite repeated assaults. At La Haye-Sainte, the legendary British infantry, renowned for its discipline and firepower, repelled several French waves. The muddy terrain limited the effectiveness of the French cavalry, commanded by Marshal Ney, who at one point ordered a massive charge without sufficient coordination. The cavalry charged against the Anglo-Dutch infantry formed in squares, suffering deadly fire. Despite their bravery, they were unable to break Wellington's defense. Meanwhile, Marshal Grouchy, who was supposed to prevent the arrival of the Prussians, failed to locate or intercept their march. Engaged in skirmishes near Wavre, he underestimated Blucher's speed and delayed moving toward the sounds of the Waterloo cannons. So, in the afternoon, the Prussian vanguard began appearing on the French right flank, sowing panic. Around 6 p.m., Napoleon finally sent his Imperial Guard in a desperate attack. This elite, the flower of the Imperial Army, charged up the plateau where Wellington stood, but the Guard, under heavy fire, started to falter. More and more Prussians appeared, threatening the French rear. The Imperial Guard retreated, an unusual event that shattered the morale of the entire army. Cries rose up. "The Guard is retreating. Every man for himself." French cohesion collapsed. Perceiving this critical moment, Wellington launched a general counterattack. The Imperial Guard, for its part, remained loyal to the end. When the Grenadiers' square was surrounded by the British and ordered to surrender, a French officer, often attributed to General Cambronne, reportedly uttered the famous line, "The Guard dies, but does not surrender." Several fractions of the Guard sacrificed themselves to cover the army's retreat, allowing Napoleon to escape the battlefield. He, disheartened, left Waterloo hastily, aware that he had just suffered an irreversible defeat. The defeat at Waterloo, combined with the threat of a massive arrival of coalition forces, definitively ruined the Napoleonic adventure. In the following days, Napoleon returned to Paris, still hoping to organize resistance. But the Chamber of Representatives, dominated by individuals seeking to spare France from another brutal occupation, demanded his abdication. On June 22, 1815, Napoleon abdicated a second time in favor of his son Napoleon II, whom history would call the Eaglet. However, as in 1814, foreign powers refused to recognize any successor. The ultra-royalists took advantage of the situation to bring back Louis XVI, who entered Paris on July 8, 1815. Napoleon, sought by the coalition, tried to find a ship to sail to America. But the British, who patrolled the Atlantic, compelled him to turn himself over at Rochefort. He still did not know the exact destination they had reserved for him. One thing was certain: they wanted to prevent any triumphant return. Napoleon, the former emperor, landed on St. Helena on October 15, 1815. This island, then administered by the British East India Company, is less than 20 kilometers long and around 10 kilometers wide. The black cliffs that encircle it, battered by constant winds, make any clandestine landing virtually impossible. The humid and changeable climate triggers fog and sudden showers, which affect Napoleon's health, already weakened. There is little vegetation, except for a few green valleys, and the rocky landscapes highlight the melancholic aspect of this exile. The British governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, takes office in 1816. Strict and not inclined towards compassion, he imposes strict regulations. Napoleon must always be accompanied by a British officer during his walks, and he is forbidden to go more than 12 miles away from his residence, named Longwood House. Correspondences are controlled, and any potential visitor is monitored. The few ships that dock must adhere to a scrupulous protocol, preventing any escape conspiracies. This rigidity exacerbates the mistrust between Lowe and his illustrious prisoner. Longwood House, located on a windy plateau, is far from being a palace. The humidity is penetrating, the walls rapidly deteriorate, and the comfort is basic. Napoleon attempts to recreate a reduced court around him. A few generals, like Bertrand or Gourgaud, watch over him, while servants manage the provisions. The days pass with restricted walks in the garden, meals taken late, and animated discussions with companions. It all gives the impression of a slow monotony, reinforced by the headaches and stomach aches regularly suffered by the ex-emperor. To alleviate the boredom, Napoleon embarks on writing his memoirs. He dictates his memories to General Gourgaud and the Count of La Cassis, writing the famous Memoirs to serve as a history of France under Napoleon. He provides his own version of major events: Italian and Egyptian campaigns, imperial coronation, battles of Austerlitz and Waterloo. The writing sessions occupy long hours, punctuated by breaks for tea or meals. Through these narratives, Napoleon shapes his legend. He reinterprets the facts to his advantage, minimizing certain mistakes, like the Russian campaign, or accusing his marshals of treason. Detractors will say he manipulates history, while his supporters see it as the expression of a lucid mind, wanting to transmit his legacy to posterity. The companions in exile do not always agree, which fuels tensions. Gourgaud, for instance, eventually falls out with Las Cases. The intrigues of this small, confined circle reveal the difficulty of living in close quarters with a man once so powerful. Since 1819, Napoleon's health has alarmingly deteriorated. He complains of stomach pains and fever crises. The doctors disagree on the exact diagnosis. Some mention an ulcer, others suspect stomach cancer, an ailment that had already taken his father, Charles Bonaparte. The humid conditions of St. Helena don't help. In the spring of 1821, his condition worsens. Constant fever, vomiting, loss of appetite. On the morning of May 5th, he falls into unconsciousness and breathes his last shortly after 5 p.m. Witnesses report confused words, making reference to France, the army, and Josephine. The phrase France, army, Josephine is often cited as his final evocation of his shattered destiny. Whether exact or embellished, these words reflect Napoleon's deep attachment to the nation, the flag, and the companion of his early years of glory. Buried on May 9, 1821, in the Valley of the Geranium, since renamed Valley of the Tomb, the former emperor rests under a stone slab without a name, in accordance with a last whim or a disagreement with the British authorities. A few French officers and English representatives attend the funeral in a sober and moving atmosphere. Subsequently, hypotheses on the exact cause of death multiply: cancer, arsenic poisoning, or simply the worsening of an untreated ulcer. The hair analyses conducted much later have perpetuated these controversies without resolving all doubts. Thus ends the epic of Napoleon Bonaparte, a figure both captivating and controversial, whose impact extends far beyond the mere chronology of his reign. Rising from the modest Corsican nobility to seize the imperial crown, he reshaped France and Europe through the power of the sword and reform, leaving behind a colossal legacy. His civil code, a true foundation of modern law, and his centralized administrative structures still form the backbone of many states today. Currently, more than 150 countries around the world apply a legal system inspired by the Napoleonic Code or its principles. His battles, from Austerlitz to Waterloo, resonate as symbols of unparalleled military genius, but also of the limits of ambition when it becomes excessive. After the definitive fall of Napoleon, the Bourbon monarchy, with Louis XVI and then Charles X, attempted to restore an old order, but failed to efface the reforms and modernity ushered in by the empire. Bonapartist ideas, fueled by nostalgia for military glory and centralization, remain alive in part of the public opinion. A few decades later, Napoleon III, the emperor's nephew, tapped into this flame to found the Second Empire, 1852-1870. Although becoming more liberal towards the end, this regime also eventually succumbed to the uncertainties of war. The Bonapartes, nonetheless, continue to feed a political movement and a myth that, over time, intersect with other ideologies in France amid monarchist temptations, republican surges, and desires for embodied authority. From this legacy, the country retains the imprint of a strong state, solid institutions, and a myth always ready to resurface when history seems to waver.